Share a few words from our sponsor. This is Kesher. We're open 365 days a year, and y'all are welcome for each and every one of them. But allow me to highlight a few upcoming programs, starting with the kickoff of our centennial celebration, Kesher 100. Our centennial officially kicks off on Monday, September 13th, with Rabbi Frendel's keynote lecture on Orthodox Judaism, what it was and what it is, and continues with a series of panels on Orthodoxy at a turning point in national conversation, the first being Orthodoxy and Innovation on October 10th, featuring Moshe Halbertal, David Novak, and David Berger. Subsequent topics include women in Orthodoxy, the denominations, spirituality and future of Orthodoxy, as well as other educational and social events planned throughout the year. To stay in touch with this and other programming, please follow us on Twitter at Kesher Israel, friend Kesher Israel on Facebook. Definitely join our email list by emailing list@kesher.org. You can do that all on your BlackBerries right now before you turn them off. You need to turn off all your cell phones and other electronic beepers before we begin. Also, although tonight's event is free, if you'd like to help sustain programming like this, we welcome your support. In Torah, loosely translated as "without dough, we don't rise." So visit our homepage at kesher.org/donate, and we'll welcome your contribution. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our speakers, Nathan Diament and Peter Beinart. Nathan is a recovering firm lawyer and has been the director of the Institute of Public Affairs at the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America for the past 16 years. Peter is first and foremost a Kesherite, but also a recovering journalist, and now a professor of journalism and political science at City University of New York, the author of the recently published The Icarus Syndrome, a fellow at the New America Foundation, and a columnist for the Daily Beast. Our speakers will each start with a brief statement, and we'll allow a free-flowing discussion to continue from there. We'll break in a little while to take your questions from the floor. Please join me in welcoming both Nathan and Peter.
Well, I guess I was told to start, and it's a pleasure to be doing this conversation with Nathan, who's someone I consider a friend for quite a long time. If there's any source of animosity that I bear towards Nathan, it really has to do only with the role that he may have played in luring Deb and Dave Sloan out of this community to Kent Mill, across the border into Maryland, or I tend to think about it, across the Green Line, where so many Kesherites have gone, never to be seen again. I'm also approach this with a little bit of trepidation, thinking about biting the hand that feeds me in this community. I mean that quite literally in terms of many, many Shabbat meals, by making criticisms of American Orthodox Judaism. And in many ways, I'm really not the ideal person, given that I did not grow up in an American Orthodox environment. I grew up in a very strange South African immigrant Sephardi milieu. But I would only say, by way of preface of some of the points that I'm going to make, that my wife and I chose this community. We chose to raise our children here because of our enormous affection and admiration for this community in particular, and for modern Orthodoxy in the United States in general, for its devotion to both religious and secular learning, for the sense of communal warmth that we found here that we had not found in other places. And so if some of my criticisms might sound harsh at times, please understand that they come from the position of someone who has decided to raise his own children in this community because of the deep love that my wife and I have grown to feel, and the deep warmth of relationship that we've formed. I wanted to mention four things in particular that I came across just in the last week or two, just looking around pretty briefly, by way of noting what I think are some troubling currents. The first is from June, from the Orthodox Union's website, a eulogy called Reflections on a True Gadol, a reference to a rabbi who's noted for his love and care toward every other Jew in the world. This is a reference to recently deceased Israeli Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu. It's not noted in that eulogy that Rabbi Eliyahu was the eulogist at Meir Kahana's funeral, was a close associate of Meir Kahana, was quite well known in Israel for having given a response in which he said that because the entire land of Israel is the Jewish people. It is acceptable for settlers or any other Israelis, for that matter, to take from Palestinian olive groves or any other Palestinian crops. That's not stealing because it's ours. Man who also said that the lives of 1,000 Arabs were not worth the life of one yeshiva student. None of that was mentioned in the eulogy on the Orthodox Jews website. In May, on the website of the National Council of Young Israel, another, for those of you who don't know, the prominent American Orthodox group, a report by the executive vice president of his recent trip to the West Bank settlement of Yitzhak, where he describes in glowing terms the Od Yosef Chai Yeshiva in Yitzhak, and the Rosh Yeshiva, who is also described as a man known for his great warmth and affection, great love for the Jewish people. And the executive vice president of the National Council of Young Israel speaks in outraged terms about the harassment that the yeshiva is facing from the Israeli government, and the prospect that it could indeed even be torn down by the Israeli government for what is described as kind of some trifling events from a few malcontents. The Od Yosef Chai Yeshiva is at the epicenter of what's become known as the price tag policy, in which efforts by the Israeli government to restrict settlement growth are systematically responded to by random attacks on innocent Palestinians. In one particular case, leading to this Rosh Yeshiva himself having been brought in for questioning in regards to the desecration of a mosque. This Rosh Yeshiva, having said, again, this has been all over the Israeli press, having written that it is acceptable to kill Palestinian children because they may grow up to be evil like their parents. This also having been a yeshiva that is boasted about the property damage they have done to IDF vehicles and in fact assaults on IDF personnel when IDF personnel have tried to interfere in these pogroms. Third example, the Israel Day concert in Central Park, which for many of you know is really essentially an Orthodox affair, in fact sponsored in association with the National Council of Young Israel. In 2006, in a very widely discussed series of comments, General F.A. Tom, Israeli General F.A. Tom said, called for the expulsion, the forced expulsion of most Palestinians from the West Bank. He did that in 2006. In 2007, General A. Tom was a guest speaker at the Israel Day concert in Central Park. In 2008, he was the keynote speaker at that concert. In 2006, during the Lebanon War, when the United Jewish Communities appealed, when it was reported in the Jewish Week that some portion of this money that had been raised by American Jews was going to benefit Arab Israelis, and remember, Arab Israelis in the Galilee were disproportionately affected by Hezbollah rocket fire. There were quotes by the leaders of both the Orthodox Union and the National Council of Young Israel talking about how troubled they were that this money raised was going to go to Israeli Arabs and not exclusively to Jews, and a suggestion that in fact perhaps these organizations would try to segregate their funds so they were only used so that money only went to Jews. I'm not suggesting that these attitudes are in the mainstream in American Orthodox Jewish life. But what I do think I would hope that people would think about is an attitude of indulgence towards these attitudes. A view that essentially tends to apologize for them by saying, well, maybe the Palestinians must have brought this kind of hatred on themselves by their bad actions, or perhaps these attitudes only come from excessive love of Am Yisrael. It's an excessive love for other Jews that may lead to an intolerant view towards non-Jews. And it seems to me incumbent upon us, as we rightly demand that the Palestinian leadership fight incitement, fight hatred in its own communities, that we also are willing to look in the mirror in the face of the kinds of incidents that I've mentioned. It seems to me that there is a need for a less indulgent attitude, for an effort at confronting some of these attitudes. Shul by shul, yeshiva day school by yeshiva day school, Shabbat lunch by Shabbat lunch. To say explicitly that the Palestinians are not Amalek, to try to do things, even things that might be considered somewhat radical, to try to create a sense of empathy and a sense of human connection with the other side. Chip Mannikin, who goes to Kesher Israel on his very, very interesting blog, Judah Magna Zionist, for instance, suggested that Palestinian refugees been brought into yeshiva day schools across the United States, not to talk about politics, but in the same spirit in which we might hope that mosques and Muslim schools would show Schindler's List as a statement about empathy at a human level, regardless of where you fall on the politics. That it seems to me it's incumbent on us to try to do the same thing. I think Orthodox Jews place, and again, one of the reasons we were attracted to this community, place an enormous emphasis on education. And often tend to say to other members of the American Jewish community, if you don't educate your children to love and understand Judaism, don't be surprised when, as adults, they don't have that sense of love and connection to Judaism, and they stray. And it seems to me that one can turn that same question around and say, if you don't teach children to have a sense of respect and love and understanding for non-Jews, don't be so surprised if your community can give birth to the next Meir Kahane or the next Baruch Goldstein. It's, after all, it's already happened. So I'll stop there.
Good evening. I think I was invited to the wrong discussion because David contacted me about this discussion. I thought the jumping off point was going to be Peter's article in the New York Review of Books, that's at least initially what I'm going to talk about a bit, although I'll try to, if not at the outset here, in our conversation, respond to some of the things that Peter has just raised. I'm very pleased to be here, particularly 2 days before Tisha B'Av, because, as Peter said, we've known each other for a while, and I consider him a friend as much as he considers me a friend. And I think in the days just before Tisha B'Av, it would be a very good thing, if nothing else, for us to get together and hopefully have what's a machloket l'shem shamayim, a disagreement for a noble purpose, rather than the type of disagreement and debate that perhaps was the sort that led to the destruction of our temples. Peter's article, as you all know, which I think was the initial catalyst for us being here this evening, was a criticism of the American Jewish establishment generally, not orthodoxy or Orthodox organizations in particular, although I suppose to some degree the Orthodox Union would plead guilty to being part of the vast American Jewish establishment. But the criticism that Peter lodged essentially was the American Jewish establishment has failed insofar as it is losing liberal American Jews that are drifting away from being supportive of the state of Israel because essentially Israel is acting more and more illiberally, and the response of the American Jewish establishment should be not to defend Israel at every turn, but to criticize Israel more aggressively in appropriate circumstances, so that, among other reasons, we will not lose these American Jews to the cause of Israel. And that's, in the first instance, what I want to respond to. And then I think some of my other remarks will circle back to what Peter did in his opening comments. The thing I want to put on the table at the outset with regard to Peter's original argument was that, as far as I can tell, Israel is a liberal democracy. It may not have a written constitution. It might have a wild system of politics that yields a factionalized parliament and many other things. But it does have open elections and a rule of law and judicial review and all the other hallmarks of a liberal democracy. And if a liberal American or a liberal American Jew's benchmark for whether or not he or she will support another country is a particular brand of American flavored liberal democracy, then the folks that have issues with Israel ought to also have an issue with, let's say, Canada, because it funds parochial schools, England because it has an established church, and Germany because it has hate speech laws that would fail under the First Amendment. So it's clearly the case that liberal Americans and liberal American Jews ought to have a more expansive and flexible, and do have a more expansive and flexible notion of what is what another country's liberal democratic systems are, such that it allows its support. So I thought, I do want to put on the record, so to speak, that I thought a flaw in Peter's argument was this assumption that, oh, Israel, it's not a liberal democracy, or it's a liberal democracy in decline, etc. But I accepted, again, David Sloan's invitation to have this conversation because he told me that the shul specifically wanted to have this conversation in a modern Orthodox context. And so I want to frame the main part of my opening comments along the following lines. And again, I'm going to do this in personal terms, not trying to talk with an organizational hat on. I'm not a liberal Zionist or right-wing Zionist. I'm a religious Zionist. And the anchors of religious Zionism, as articulated years ago by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, are that a Jew's commitment to Israel is based on a covenant of faith and a covenant of fate. That the religious Zionist commitment to Israel derives from religious teaching and religious history and a religious mission, and that connects us to the Holy Land, literally, and the Jewish population of that land. And alongside that, a deep commitment to Jewish peoplehood. And as such, whether or not the modern state of Israel is a liberal democracy with a capital L, perfect or otherwise, does not and ought not determine certainly a religious Zionist commitment to Israel and her people. If the Messiah arrives this Tuesday, as we will be hoping for, and the Knesset is dissolved and replaced with the Davidic monarchy, and the Supreme Court of Israel is dissolved and replaced with the Sanhedrin, that will be a cause for joy and celebration, not for mourning the loss of liberal democratic institutions. If the current state of Israel codifies Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot as its federal holidays, and has laws that are consistent with Shabbat observance in the public square, and does not do other things that might be the hallmarks of liberalism in America or in Western Europe, but is doing those things to give life to a Jewish state, which is more than a place that happens to have a majority population of Jews, that is desirable, and that's the kind of Israel that a religious Zionist wishes to support. Now, I agree with Peter that there are many American Jews who are or becoming more disaffected with Israel, and I agree that that's a problem in terms of the interests of Israel and American support for Israel. I took offense at Peter's implication in his article that placed the Orthodox community, and he sort of did this a little bit, although not quite, just a few minutes ago, the Orthodox community as the boogeyman to scare the liberal Zionists. That, liberal American Jews, you better figure out your pro-Israel activism, or AIPAC's going to be full of Orthodox Jews, so to speak. Heaven forfend. Now, I don't think that the Orthodox community's passion for Israel and commitment to Israel and willingness to turn out in the tens of thousands, more than the tens of thousands, for a rally on the National Mall or other things should be viewed as, and I'm not saying Peter's saying it quite this way, but for some people that's viewed as, we better not let these folks take over. That's a point of pride, and other segments of the Jewish community that are not in the Orthodox camp should, in the Pirkei Avot sense of the word terms, be jealous of that and want to emulate that more in their own way. Now, I'm not so naive such that I think the answer to the problem of the waning or the increased disaffection to support for Israel is to try to convert all these liberal American Jews into religious Zionists. However, I think I wanted to talk about the religious Zionist point of view, again, because we're here in a modern Orthodox congregation, which is committed to religious Zionism, but also because I think that it yields lessons for the broader community and the broader agenda. Again, that Israel's liberalism ought not be the sole determining basis of a Jewish person's support, and B, even if we can't have more American Jews embracing the covenant of faith such that it would drive them to support Israel, we can certainly work much harder to have them embrace the covenant of fate, to have them have a much deeper sense of Jewish identity, to have a much deeper commitment to Jewish peoplehood. That's in fact what Natan Sharansky has charted as the new mission of the Jewish Agency in Israel. And if there's a failure of the American Jewish establishment, or to put it a different way, if there's something that the American Jewish establishment, Orthodox or otherwise, needs to redouble its efforts on, I would say it's working on building Jewish identity and a sense of Jewish peoplehood. Okay, if you're a left-winger on the Israeli political security issues, and you thought that the withdrawal from Gaza was not only necessary but desirable, that should not at all be inconsistent with that a person of that political perspective feeling deep pain and loss, or deep pain and empathy for the Jewish Israeli residents of Gaza who were taken from their homes and are still, years later, living in a very dislocated state. And by the way, that's not only a charge to be lodged at American Jews, it's a charge to be lodged with a lot of Jews who live in Tel Aviv, which Ari Shavit and other non-religious writers in Israel have written about. There's another point that I want to emphasize, which for me derives from a religious Zionist education and perspective that relates, again, to this sort of the peace and security debates. And may also relate to some of the things that Peter mentioned this evening. There are folks in the non-religious pro-Israel community whose general approach on matters with regard to Israel is to be supportive of what the incumbent Israeli government wants to do. So if they want to make a land for peace deal, they're going to support a land for peace deal. If the government is opposing the land for peace deal, these people are going to oppose a land for peace deal. They take their marching orders, not literally, but they take their cues from wanting to support the people in Israel. There's a religious, so to speak, basis for that perspective as well. There are, without going into the details in the form of a shiur here, of the kind that Rabbi Freundel could give, there are halachot and hashkafic writings in the literature which thematically emphasize the notion that from the old days, that the population of the Jewish population in Israel has more of a say in matters of national destiny of the Jewish people than the people in the diaspora. An easy little example to give is that the setting of the calendar, right? The sanctification of the new month each month, and the setting of the calendar, which not only the Jews in Israel would abide by, but Jews throughout the diaspora would abide by in terms of when the holidays fall and so on and so forth, that had to be done in Israel and only in Israel. And there are other halakhic structures and categories as well that you can thematically, and rabbis do thematically, weave together a message that the population in Israel has a more primary role in making decisions that affect the Jewish nation as a whole. And so religious Zionists have to be mindful of that from a religious perspective as well. So that's why when an Israeli government recently could decide to get out of Gaza, and the Orthodox Jewish population here, which is not only very empathetic and also identifies with the folks living in those Gaza communities, and was very agitated and very upset about the withdrawal from Gaza, ultimately, at least in the form of the position that the Orthodox Union as an organization took, and others, did not oppose a withdrawal from Gaza, but deferred to the decision, for better or for worse, that the elected government of Israel made. A second important point from the religious perspective is that religious Zionists are committed to the system of halakha, and that means being committed to that system as a whole. And an intellectually honest religious Zionist, in my humble opinion, but I am not a rabbi, and I will defer the halakhic psak questions, in this case, in this congregation, to Rabbi Freundel, but in my humble opinion, a religious Zionist cannot be intellectually honest and be opposed to a land for peace deal. Because the principle of pikuach nefesh is a cardinal of saving lives, is a cardinal principle of the halakha, And what I'm saying here is not my own thing. This is why Rabbi Yehuda Amital of blessed memory, who just passed away, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, or Rabbi Lichtenstein, or many other Rosh Yeshiva say the same thing, which is that ultimately, if you had a land for peace deal that would in fact save lives, not only among Israelis, but also among Arabs, would in fact save lives, that the principles of Pikuach Nefesh and Halacha would necessitate accepting that deal. Now, that leaves room for a whole debate over, is the deal that's on the table actually going to save lives, right? Is there going to be real security, or are there going to be rockets coming into Rathavia from the Judean hills once they're controlled by the Palestinians? That's a factual debate. That's not a halakhic debate. But the religious Zionist, to be intellectually honest, is committed to the halakhic system as a whole and cannot, in my humble opinion, and the opinions of prominent rabbis of this camp, cannot rule out as a matter of principle those kinds of possibilities. So I think, again, in sum, that in terms of Peter's original argument, that the mission has to be much more, the mission of the American community at large, and we in the religious Zionist community, I think, can model this in a lot of ways and work with the non-religious pro-Israel camp in a lot of ways, is to find the new ways beyond birthright, so to speak, to instill in more and more American Jews a commitment to Jewish peoplehood and a commitment to Israel that allows them to place that again higher on their priority list than it's sliding down lately. I don't agree that the prescription is jump on the criticizing Israel bandwagon for the sake of wooing them closer. In terms of some of the things that Peter said, or at least I've heard him say for the first time this evening, I would say that the religious Zionist camp, or the Orthodox camp, like any other segment of the community, has diversity within it. And Peter was honest enough to say that some of the views he cited, he was not accusing them to be mainstream views, but is concerned that they are indulged, or I would say, maybe he also might say they were apologized for in the Orthodox community with greater frequency or willingness than perhaps in other quarters of the Jewish community. That may well be true, and from a normative perspective, without going into each and every one of those incidents, is probably not desirable. But the fact that he can point to a difficult statement or an objectionable statement from Rav Mordechai Eliyahu on the one hand, but that you also had a Rabbi Yehuda Amital, on the other hand, the Orthodox community, so to speak, broadly speaking, shows you the diversity of the community and shows you that there's a debate, and we could get further into discussion, I suppose, about what's mainstream and what's not mainstream, although I don't know how fruitful that would be. So I guess I'd just like to conclude at this part with saying that, again, here, days before Tisha B'Av, what we really need to strive for is a greater commitment of the principle of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, and not as sentimental pablum, but as a central commitment that we have to make for the sake of the Jewish people and for the sake of Zion.
Well, there's a lot there that I really agreed with, and actually more than agreed with. I thought was really, I was just really grateful to hear you say. The first is the idea that Orthodox Jews do not essentially give up on the rest of the American Jewish community. That there could be, you could imagine a triumphalist view which would say, look, 12% of American Jews over the age of 60 are Orthodox, but 33% between the ages of 18 and 24 are Orthodox. Demographically, things are moving our way. What do we need to worry about? These people who are halfway towards being Episcopalians anyway. We can create a Zionism based on a political alliance between frum Jews and evangelical Christians, and we'll be fine. And I have to say, I've actually was really heartened by the response to my piece, by how rarely I've heard that, and particularly, and never heard any trace of that from Nathan in his comments on the piece tonight. And I think that the spirit of looking for a way of thinking respectfully about all members of the American Jewish community, I think, is really a crucial place to begin. And I also thought it was really valuable and important for you to say, Nathan, that in your view, it's absolutely halachically acceptable to give up land for peace, which I understand it. Again, many would know better than me. That was also Ralph Soloveitch's view, and I think it seems to me important to say that. But I guess where it strikes me that to say that today is to invite an argument. And I guess I would suggest that although I think respect is important, that argument is really important. Because if you look at the website of the National Council of Israel, I can't speak for the Orthodox Union, it explicitly says no Palestinian state, period. In the Jewish press.
I work for the OU. You shouldn't start
on
the National Council of Israel.
Okay, but I'm not asking.
I can't say anything good about that.
Okay, I'm just saying that I think I'm not sure that the view that you expressed is the mainstream view, and I particularly the greater concern that it's not the mainstream view in the national religious, or for that matter, the Haredi camps in Israel. And so, if it's something that we believe deeply, and as you say, it leaves a wide range of, you can believe that and still have a wide range of opinions about when you're going to get to that point and if and all that stuff. But if you believe that, it seems to me it's important to say it and then be willing to have the argument with people who don't believe it, because the people who don't believe it are not marginal. I mean, it's the explicit editorial position of the Jewish press, for instance, that you should never withdraw from one piece of land of Eretz Israel. I mean, that's their editorial line. So it seems to me if this is the position that you hold, then it seems to me it's important to say that, and it seems to me for us to be willing to have that argument, because I'm really glad. I'm very, very glad you did. On the question of a dystopic scenario in which Orthodox Jews take over AIPAC, what I was trying to suggest is that there are very different struggles, I think, that are taking place within the Orthodox world and the non-Orthodox world. The 2006 AEJ, American Jewish Committee study of American Jews 18 to 40, they say, do you feel very connected to the state of Israel? Amongst Orthodox Jews, it's 79%. Amongst non-Orthodox Jews, it's 16%. This is an ocean of difference. And so I don't for a minute suggest that Orthodox Jews should be embarrassed about the fact that they have managed to inculcate a vibrant Zionism in their children. Absolutely not. The vibrancy of that Zionism is to be celebrated. I couldn't agree with that more. I think the challenge is to make sure that it's a liberal Zionism, because I think it is terrific that you can bring thousands and thousands of young Jewish people to the mall in 2002 for an Israel rally. But it's not terrific, in my mind, when those people boo Paul Wolfowitz when he says we should be concerned about Palestinian suffering as well. And it's really not, it seems to be really problematic when Malcolm Hoenlein, the head of the President's Conference, essentially says, in response to that, not that we should do soul searching, but that Wolfowitz should not have said it, that it was not an appropriate comment to make. It seems to me that's the struggle, it seems to me. I mean, you may well, I can't disagree with you. When Mashiach comes, we'll have a whole different set of concerns and issues to deal with. But it seems to me, I think we could hopefully agree that regardless of what the political debates would look like in that environment, and maybe that will revive print journalism too. And all kinds of problems that I worry about won't be a problem. But I think I would hope at least
for Friday editions.
Yes, exactly. I guess I would at least hope that in the intermediate period that we could accept that we do believe that it's an enormous importance, and we take great pride in the fact that Israel is a vibrant liberal democracy. I think it is a vibrant liberal democracy, but I think in some ways it's also a liberal democracy in peril. When you have, for instance, a study came out of Tel Aviv University in March, showed that 50% of Israeli high school students should not believe that Arab Israelis should be allowed to be elected to Knesset, and 82% of religious Israeli high school students do not believe that. I think there is a clash of values, and I think you do see it reflected in the power represented by people like Avigdor Lieberman and Ovadia Yosef. And I think it's something that I think what I would what I would hope you could say to the non-Orthodox part of the American Jewish community, where the problem is not liberalism, but the problem is that Zionism is in collapse. You could say, essentially, we want to engage you in a struggle for Israeli liberal democracy, a struggle to maintain this extraordinary thing, which is the creation of a liberal democracy in such a difficult environment. And that is the kind of Zionism that you can be appealed to, not the Zionism of telling you that there are no problems in Israel, of a birthright experience that doesn't even take you to go to the West Bank, or to confront any of these problems. But in fact, that's honest about the struggles that are going on in Israel, the threats to Israeli democracy, and that invites young American Jews to, in fact, be part of that struggle. And I think that could be compelling for those relatively secular young American Jews who've drifted away from Zionism, and I hope it also could be compelling to some younger Orthodox Jews as well, who want to maintain the vibrancy of their Zionism, but also fight for it to have a liberal democratic character.
But I think in the middle of your discussion there about a liberal democracy in Israel, again, there's an element of desiring a liberal democracy in Israel that basically looks like an American version, an American pluralistic or multicultural kind of society. And that's not the only model of a liberal democracy. I really don't want to get into the business of defending Victor Lieberman, but I want to make the following comment, which is that at least what I've heard him say on one particular point, or I've heard others say when they talk about issues about basically, if we're going to have a two-state solution, it shouldn't just be we're drawing a border, but we should separate the two populations. I've heard Victor Lieberman explicitly point to the other ethnic conflicts around the world, in Bosnia and other places like that, where the solution for the two populations is for them to get a divorce, right? Is for them to be separated in a way that allows them to each live their ethnic and national lives without constantly rubbing against one another. That's not the American model at all. We want the multicultural salad bowl of ethnicities and religions and everything else in this country. But that's not the case, around in many places around the world, and given the fact that Israel, the first Intifada killed, so to speak, the idealism for some of the greater Israel, returning to the borders of King David. The second Intifada killed the believers in Oslo and the Shimon Peres vision of we're going to create the Netherlands in the Middle East, and we're all going to sit around and make high-tech, devices together. Both of those ideal visions have been killed by the intervening events, and at least on the Israeli side, my sense of it is, as Tzipi Livni says, Tzipi Livni says that she doesn't want a two-state solution for the sake of the Palestinians. She wants a two-state solution for the sake of Israel. She wants a divorce. And so I think, again, we have to come back to the issue of the liberal democratic society that is and will be the state of Israel does not have to conform to what that means philosophically or the mores of that here in the United States. And to insist upon that is not necessary and perhaps counterproductive.
Well, I don't think I'm insisting upon it. I mean, I still want an Israel, the Jewish state, and so that in and of itself, with a law of return, makes it radically different than the United States. I mean, where we would shudder at the prospect that America would have any, where I certainly opposed to America having any public religious identity. So I'm willing, I think, to imagine an Israel that's pretty dramatically different from the United States, and I don't have a problem. I don't think, at least for me, I can't speak for others, I mean, at least for me, my problem with political currents in Israel is not that there are a lot of people in Israel who want a divorce. In the case of Lieberman, it's a number of things, but part of it is that his vision of a divorce involves drawing the border such that basically the Israeli Arabs who live near the Green Line are essentially divorced against their will. I mean, these are people who mostly want to be Israelis, think of themselves as Israeli. They could have moved to a Palestinian state. They don't want to be Palestinian. And he's created, and what his vision of a divorce is basically to redraw the boundaries so against their will they find themselves members of a different country. And I think that is highly liberal, not just because it's different from the American model. I just think it's repulsive, period. And I think, if Tzipi Livni believes that you want a divorce and that's good for Israel, I wholeheartedly agree with her. But my fear is, I think there's a reason that she's not in the government, which is that the guy who did become prime minister doesn't have that vision. I mean, if he wanted that, he could have brought her into the government. He opposed a Palestinian state his entire career. He opposed it when he was running. He opposed it during the coalition building process. He's said under enormous pressure last summer he basically gave a speech in which he said that he was for a Palestinian state, but basically gave two caveats that explicitly divided his position from the positions of former prime ministers like Barak and Olmert. For instance, no division of Jerusalem, that I think practically make any idea of a Palestinian state impossible to imagine based on what we know from the negotiations that took place in 2001. So my problem is not with those Israelis who want a kind of a divorce. My problem is that I feel we have a governing coalition in Israel that is that in fact will not allow that divorce to take place. We solved it, which is the good news. We can just wait around for them tomorrow.
I'm happy to go to questions.
Yeah. Dave, you want to?
I'll be happier if David does the call.
All right, David,
there was no expectation that y'all would run out of things to say, but certainly no objection. We'll take as many questions from the crowd as time allows. So by a show of hands, certainly. Carol, please.
Peter, I'm curious about your use of liberal, and I'm wondering if you can define it for us.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean by liberal a state which has a commitment to the rule of law, to due process, to limits on to a free press, a free judiciary, an independent judiciary, I should say, to limits on the power of the executive branch, and if not. I wouldn't even say, just to give you a sense that my liberalism in the Israeli context is not exactly the same as my liberalism in America, I would not even necessarily say equal rights in exactly the same sense as I mean in the United States, because I recognize in a Jewish state where you have a law of return, there may not be exactly equal rights, but I would say at least a very robust dedication to minority rights. So that would be what I mean by it.
Other questions?
Apropos to your comment at the end about Tzipi Livni not being in the government, where the government is now, when I first read the article, I thought of it as the struggle for the soul of Zionism as a very high-stakes argument. And then upon further thought, especially apropos to some of your comments about the role of American Jews, in some ways this is a much more high-stakes argument in Israel than it is here. And I guess my question then becomes, what, if anything, even if best-case scenario, Peter, we were to see Orthodoxy embrace this more robust conception of liberalism, we were to see more engagement from conservative and reform Jews, we were to see kind of the vision of an American Jewish establishment that you outlined, aren't the demographic and political challenges on the ground in Israel great enough that wherever American Zionism goes, we still have these same issues?
I'm sorry, you mean you're saying they have the same issues in the United States? It was the future of
in Israel.
Oh, in Israel. Well, I'll say something, and I don't want to monopolize this, so then I'll turn it over to Nathan. No, I don't think those issues go away. I mean, you have structural issues about, for instance, the demographic shift towards the Haredi population that are quite significant. For instance, but it's interesting. I mean, how much influence do American Jews wield in Israel when they really, really, really care about something? When they really see it as an issue of first principle? I think we're going to find out. We're going to find out with this conversion bill. And I suggest that we're already seeing evidence that, in fact, the influence is pretty significant. And my hope, and maybe it's you can call it completely fanciful and romantic, that American Jews who are concerned about their own ox being gored in terms of their own status in Israel could have the same degree of moral commitment when it comes to the rights of non-Jews.
I was brought up to believe that Orthodox Jews stand for standards, high standards of, let us say, morality. I find now that in looking at groups in Israel, the people that are least concerned with human rights, but are least liberal, tend to be the Haredim, the most orthodox. What does this tell us about the modern Orthodox? Do we find the modern Orthodox becoming a sort of cult, concerned with eating the right things and not doing the wrong things on Shabbat? Why is it that the modern Orthodox seem to have lost the ideas of morality and liberalism that we were brought up to believe in?
Well, conveniently, it's Nathan's turn.
Are you using,
That is a question for Nathan.
are you using modern Orthodox with a capital M, so to speak, or are you using modern Orthodox in terms of orthodoxy of today? I was a little confused.
Either.
Okay. So,
I went to your website.
I mean, I think what you
could
see-
find nothing on your website about these issues. Your website is concerned with kashrut.
well, that's a big part of the website. There's some other parts.
Read Nathan's blog. It's not mostly about culture.
In the context of Israel, what I would point to is, I mean, you do obviously and clearly have a struggle between the Haredi community, and by the way, like any other set, there are multiple Haredi communities, and there are multiple Dati Leumi, religious Zionist / modern Orthodox communities in Israel. Talking in very broad strokes, there is a movement within the more centrist religious Zionist camp. There are folks and there are leaders that are concerned about the ascendancy of the Haredi camp and its views on some of the kinds of issues that we've been talking about this evening. There's an organization called Sohar, which is a group of still relatively young, dynamic, centrist, religious Zionist rabbis, led by Rabbi Rafi Feuerstein in Jerusalem, Rabbi Yuval Sherlow, who's the Rosh Yeshiva of the Hesder Yeshiva in Petach Tikva, and many others, who are trying to create a new vanguard of we're just amongst friends here, the kind of modern orthodoxy, religious Zionism in Israel that Peter would love. To take it out of the context of Israeli Arab relations. They do talk about Israeli Arabs and the plight of Israeli Arabs and things like that. To take it out of that context entirely, a couple of years ago, when there was some of the more Haredi-controlled rabbinates in Israel, they were coming into a Shemitah year, and some of the more Haredi local chief rabbinets, like Chief Rabbinate of Haifa and elsewhere, wanted to say, we're not going to abide by the Heter Mechira this time around, right? The institution that Rabbi Cook put in place, which was in order for the Israeli community to be able to abide by the Shemitah law, but still be able to eat, right? They came up with a device which was basically temporarily selling the farms to a non-Jew, so you could still work them in the Shemitah year, and then people would have food to eat. There were some Haredi rabbinates that wanted to say, this time around, 2 years ago, we're not going to abide by that. And the Tzaddik came forward and very aggressively pushed against that, and the Haredi proponents lost in that fight. They're trying to build up more power, and again, this conversion bill is going on right now. They're trying to play a role in that debate. So you have these debates in Israel. You have these struggles in Israel. They're going to go on for a long time to come. And in terms of there are issues of both Beinart al-Makom and also the kinds of Beinart al morality type issues that you would talk about as well.
Both of you briefly mentioned the Birthright Israel program. Since 2000, I think 250,000 young Jews participated in Birthright, and I'm wondering what you think the impact of that experience and the fact that so many more young Jews have been going to Israel than they had been before 2000, what that impact will be on their relationship with Israel.
I'm just going to repeat the question. What the impact of the hundreds of thousands of young Jews who have traveled to Israel since 2000 on Birthright, what effects that has on this situation?
I mean, I have nothing, I have no problem with Birthright whatsoever. I mean, I think actually, frankly, Birthright is a better use of the American Jewish community's money than I think some things I think it's I think it's a better use of money than Holocaust memorials because I think it speaks to the potential for living. I think that you would probably actually have you might even have an even bigger impact on attachment to Zionism actually if you made Jewish day school affordable than even Birthright. But Birthright is great too. I think there's some debate among sociologists about how long-term the impact is, as I understand. I mean, there clearly is a short-term impact. The question is, how does it get sustained over time? I would posit, I mean, I guess my theory would be that you would actually have a greater impact in terms of creating a sense of connection to Israel were Birthright to be more open. And I know there have been debates around Birthright and this, more open essentially to discussing controversial and difficult things and taking people into difficult environments, places where Israel may not look quite as rosy as Birthright might want. I actually think that would be, I think that would help rather than hinder the process of creating an attachment to Israel. And I know that so I would suggest that tweak to Birthright. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I've been told by many people that there is a demand for that. There's like almost a samizdat movement in Israel where young American, other Jewish kids come and they get in touch on their own with people who will take them, to the West Bank or to Sheikh Jarrah or whatever. And I actually think that would make Birthright more successful, not less successful.
I just want to comment on, the ringing endorsement of making day school more affordable. Glad we could agree on that.
Some parents on the panel.
Two things. First, I want to say that as a parent of a child going on Birthright, I don't agree with that because I was concerned with safety. If it's guaranteed safety, I have no problem with it. Going to the West Bank now, or to Gaza, to me, as a parent, get more great. But what I want to, my point is this. I have two strong beliefs right now. And I haven't heard it mentioned, but I feel very strongly about it. And I don't know if I'm the only one in the room who feels this way. They are these. Number one, I think right now Israel has a very severe existential threat. I think it's as severe as any since 48, maybe including it. I believe that. Number two, I believe my safety and my family's safety as a Jew, going on in my grandchildren's safety, that the state of Israel existing, whether it's liberal, or however you want to find it, as a Jewish state is critical to our safety. That seems to me would frame this discussion, and I would like to see not a tax of one Jew another Jew, but some way to openly bring them together, because we all have to be together. Because if we don't help each other, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, in this discussion, then I think we're doomed as a state. It didn't seem to be framed in this discussion. Am I wrong?
Can I just ask, what is the nature of the existential threat that you're referring to?
I'm saying with a potential nuclear bomb, with the enemies that attack Israel, that I'm concerned. You mentioned, it seemed to me, projecting your objection to Prime Minister Netanyahu and what he says about two states. That to me, the threat of Israel's existence physically this. It seems to be a framing discussion in my mind.
No, I mean, I agree that those are two realities, that the Iranian nuclear threat is literally existential, at least insofar as the Iranian president, should be, says so. He wants to eliminate Israel's existence and is pursuing the means to do so. And your second point, that even now, circa 2010, that Jews around the world are more secure, by and large, because of the existence of Israel, than if we live in a world without it. I think those are both clearly correct. I think there's and I think part of the problem, part of my sense of why so many people were agitated by Peter's article, and by some others who in much different ways in the community are seen as being more critical or calling for more criticism of Israel, is that if for people who have an allegiance to the security of the state and feel that it is under attack, feel that it's under assault, call for additional criticism or actions of additional criticism are seen as not helping Israel.
I'm going to second a motion what this gentleman said here. He's absolutely right. Part of your discussions really didn't go into this existential threat, nor to the attitude of the world community. The Gaza fiasco is the most recent example. Instead of standing up and saying, we understand why they blockaded, I don't have to go into that. So this has been a driving motive for the way Israel has acted. And I think, Peter, you're talking about a utopia when you talk about a liberal Israel. When you talk about these problem, and you also mentioned, Nathan, on the Lieberman, on the Israeli Arabs, according to recent polls that were taken, the majority of them, they're better off, they understand living within Israel. However, they align themselves with Palestinians. And being Muslims, and nobody's mentioned the word Islam here, and that's rather tragic. That's a highly motivating factor. Many of these Israeli Arabs would prefer, as part of their culture, to live under Islam than under an infidel government control. And I think that's part of the dialogue. It's also part of the dialogue that for 62 years, Israel has faced the kinds of threats from within and without. And we talk about Israelis in the cabinet. It is a liberal society. It is we see Israeli Arabs in the Knesset, including the ones who went up to Damascus, and the one who was up on the border in his fellow war. What were they doing? They were reporting to the border the movement of Israeli armed units going and so forth. That's a definite threat. So it'd be real nice to be able to say, hey, let's have a liberal society, a multicultural, all that. Peter, it doesn't work. And your example about Shah Jari, I think it was. Sheikh Jari, I think, was a little bit misleading because you talked about Israel going in and demolishing or taking over homes that Arabs were living in, but at the same time, you failed to mention that they were living in homes illegally, that there was an agreement put down by the Supreme Court in Israel that granted the Arabs the right to live there, providing they paid rent. They chose not to.
A chance to respond at this point.
Well, no, there were so many areas.
There are a lot.
I'm sorry.
I would say the idea of Israel as a vibrant liberal democracy is a utopia. It was also Theodor Herzl's utopia. If you read Altenaland, Herzl's book about what he imagined the Jewish state would be, the president of that fictional state says in his final words, we must protect the stranger among us. It was also Chad Hayam's utopia. If you look at the introduction to his collected writing about the vision that Chad Hayam had. Right. So if you want to accuse those people of utopianism, I'll share their utopianism and believe that Israel has the capacity in fact, to remain a liberal democratic society, even though it does have real enemies. But I think the crucial thing when you face real enemies, it seems to me, is not to create more enemies, and in fact be able to isolate your enemies. And it's interesting. There was a poll during the Lebanon War. They asked Israeli Jews what percentage of them thought Israeli Arabs supported Hezbollah over Israel. And they said, the Israeli Jews said 65% of Israeli Jews said the Arabs were more supportive of Hezbollah. But when they polled Israeli Arabs, they found that only 18% of Israeli Arabs, in fact, supported Hezbollah. I'm not saying that there are not questions about loyalty and identity. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to? I mean, the Orr Commission itself in 2000, in the wake of the killing of Israeli Arabs, said that the discrimination against Israeli Arabs is a threat to Israeli security. So you can respond to that, as Avigdor Lieberman does, by further demonizing this population and driving them further away. Right now, they don't want to live in a Palestinian state. Right now, they're objecting to Avigdor Lieberman's suggestion.
Because of the social security they get from Israel.
Let's let her
that may be part of the reason. The question is, how are you going to confront these trends? Are you going to confront them by basically trying to deal with the massive discrimination that exists in housing and education, for instance, or are you going to respond by demonizing and disenfranchising people and sending them into Hezbollah's arms? The only other point I would take on this point of criticism, say we were having this discussion in the United States in the 1950s or 60s, when the United States was being bombarded by delegitimizing criticism from the Soviet Union and the communist world every day about America's treatment of African Americans, right? And the Soviet Union used this endlessly as a propaganda tool to basically try to delegitimize the United States. How dare you, under that set of assault against the United States around the world, add to the criticism by, in fact, criticizing America's policies of discrimination towards African Americans? It seems to me there is a fundamental difference between criticism made from a perspective of love, based on trying to help a society be the best society it can be, and criticism that comes from a position of trying to destroy. It seems to me we understood that implicitly during the Cold War in the United States, and it seems to me that we can understand that vis-a-vis Israel as well.
I just want to interject on that last point, which is I think, at least for me, that there's a distinction to be made between some of the kinds of criticisms that you're raising, which is Israel needs to look carefully at how it deals with the Israeli Arab population and assure their social welfare and so on and so forth. And what generally, the other topics which are more generally talked about, in these kinds of discussions, which I would call, the security issues, and the debates around, is Netanyahu or Sharon or Olmert or whoever it is, are they making the right or wrong decisions with regard to the peace process or with regard to Iran and so on and so forth. And it's on those issues in particular where I would say, again, going back to something I mentioned before, where I think the mainstream pro-Israel community view is, and as I tried to elucidate before, I think also reinforced by a religious Zionist perspective, is to be much more deferential to decisions that, to borrow from the liberal piece, the democratically elected government of Israel is making on those kinds of questions. And when it's those people whose lives are on the line, right? Their sons and daughters that are serving in the IDF, and they're, and so on and so forth. And they're the ones that need to make those decisions about, okay, are we going to turn over this territory or not? Is it going to, end up with rockets, coming down on our houses or not? That those of us in the diaspora have to be much more deferential. We get a voice, but we don't get a vote. If we want to vote, there's a law of return. And people can, get on a plane, and the Nefesh makes it a heck of a lot easier these days. Everybody here, is entitled to go there and get a vote. And we have to be much more careful and much more deferential in terms of the life and death decisions that country and its population.
But Nathan, if I could just respond briefly. I mean, when Ehud Barak said a little while ago that he criticized some in his own government for basically supporting the demolition of homes and further building in East Jerusalem, and he criticized that, saying it was provocative, it was hostile, you criticized Barak. Right. So it seems to me there was a situation, the OU criticized the Israeli government during the withdrawal from Amona during the Sharon years. So it seems to me, if you're willing to give yourself that license, and I think you have every right to do it, then why shouldn't others also have the same license to criticize from their perspective?
I think we should. I think it needs to be done in a framework where we are expressing a view, but not trying to leverage leverage that view to the point of imposing or affecting the decisions that are made there. What I mean by, and the line is crossed when we try to leverage the important support of the United States for Israel and try to basically suggest that, well, maybe we American Jews or some American Jews are going to urge people or going to urge Congress or urge the administration not to offer that support, not to provide that support of Israel if Israel is not making the decisions that we want to make. Even if we think those decisions are in Israel's best interest. That's a much different ballgame.
I'm going to make a modest request with only a few minutes left and lots of questions, and all questions be phrased in the form of a question. Right here.
Switching gears a little bit, back to what we were talking about before, and specifically your article. Rather than the argument that the Jewish establishment has failed my generation, is it possible, or how would you respond to the fact that Judaism in America has evolved, and that Judaism is much more of an ethnicity as opposed to a religion?
I don't see the future of Judaism as an ethnicity and not a religion as a bright one. I just don't think I think that the ethnic cultural tendencies that are genuinely meaningful to one generation, I think in the United States become kitsch and don't substitute for a genuine connection to a living religious tradition. Now that's my own personal view, and it's not, in some sense, it's beyond the scope of the argument that we've been having. But I think you may well be right as a descriptive point that is happening. But I think normatively, it doesn't. That doesn't strike me as a particularly fruitful development in terms of Jewish continuity. If that's the perspective that you come at it from. Go ahead.
Sorry, Pat.
Sure.
In the vein of liberalism, as you've been talking about a lot, couldn't you argue that this generation has experienced unprecedented liberalism in America, and they've been fortunate enough to explore their Judaism, experiment with their Judaism, pluralism?
Yes. No, and in terms of, you're talking about pluralism in terms of inside the American Jewish community, different forms of worship, different forms. I mean, I think that's all great. It's interesting. Liberalism as a set of political ideas about how you want the state to be run and how you want the state to connect to society, I am foursquare behind. Liberalism as a cultural ethos, I have more concerns about. Frankly, I wouldn't want the state to ever enforce that. I think everyone has the right to do what they want. But if liberalism as a cultural ethos essentially is saying it's wrong to ever draw any divisions between any people, that you have to be a pure universalist, then that's not the liberalism. That doesn't appeal to me, and I think that is in conflict with Jewish continuity.
So I was wondering, and I'll direct this question to Nathan, more on the topic of minority rights. We talked a lot about Israeli Arabs, and that's obviously a very politically charged question in terms of the security question, but I think there's a lot of other issues that could be discussed in terms of illiberal trends within Israeli society. And I think that particularly the incident that happened last week with the woman who was arrested at the Kotel for carrying a Torah, and a point that some rabbi made, I forgot who, that if a woman was arrested for carrying a Torah in any other country, American Jews would be up in arms. How dare you curtail our religious freedom? But in Israel, or particularly the Orthodox community, I haven't heard very much from. How would you, in your role in the OU, sort of respond to that in context of the argument that Peter was making in his article?
I'll just say, the OU hasn't responded to it, I'll say. It's not my decision alone. Take a step back, the overall challenge that Israel confronts, or that Orthodoxy in Israel confronts, is how do you basically keep the Jewish people together? And how do you have a situation where 3 generations later, a Jewish boy can marry a Jewish girl and have Jewish children? That's really the challenge that's confronted by the community. And it's not uniquely an Orthodox challenge. I mean, just between us, sorry, web camera, just between us, I had a conversation last week with a leader of the conservative movement here in the United States, the conservative Jewish denomination, and we were talking about the conversion bill, the controversy that's going on in Israel right now, and he said to me, well, we don't recognize Reform conversions, the conservative movement, so it's not unique, so to speak, to the Orthodox community, and the challenge that Israel must confront is how do you have rules in place where, again, 3 generations later, people can get married and people can have children and so on and so forth. And on certain things, that requires some benchmarks and what, in a certain sense is it's not a lowest common denominator, but it's also in a certain sense a highest common denominator, and that it has to be something that that all the groups can recognize, at least many groups can recognize. So that's the fundamental challenge that they confront. It relates to conversion. I would say it does not relate directly to how people worship at the Western Wall, although that's how the people involved in making the decisions about the Western Wall think about it. And maybe a conversation or a discussion has to be had over there that maybe makes people there understand it differently than those categories, but the thinking there, and I'm saying this descriptively, not prescriptively, is that the Western Wall is a place where everybody should be able to come and worship, and you do that in a way that doesn't make it a problem, for individuals, and they're not thinking about it in group categories. But again, I think they could, you could understand logically how you might separate that out from the conversion and marriage and other personal status issues like that. That's fundamentally the issue they're confronting. My personal thought for a long time has been is, if we can ever get to a place where Israel can no longer be spending all its time on life and death issues like Iranian nuclear weapons and Hezbollah and Hamas and things like that, then they'll have the time
to go to war over these issues.
Then they're going to have the time to deal with these issues. I mean, the truth of the matter is, when you had in the heyday of the Oslo years, when Israeli society felt that things were moving in the right direction on the peace track, you actually had a lot of ferment and a lot of discussion in Israel going on. That's when they were talking about an Israeli constitution in a serious way, and that's when a lot of these social issues. I mean, you had everybody remember that Amir Peretz ran, not so long ago on a social welfare platform. I mean, he was a labor guy. I mean, and his career was destroyed afterwards because unfortunately he became defense minister and did a terrible job at that. But there was for a limited moment not too long ago, there was an Israeli election campaign that was about domestic social welfare issues, not about foreign policy, so to speak. But when you have the life and death security issues, that they take up all the space, and they can't grapple with these other questions.
I apologize that we have time for one more question, but I'll encourage you all to join us for some light refreshments downstairs where you can banter further, or bash, or whatever B word you choose to use. And Shelley will give you the list.
For me, the central insight in Peter's article was the gap, the divide between the American Jewish leadership and the younger generation, the generations. And the fact that the American Jewish leadership is not tolerating any internal dissent, even when that kind of dissent or debate is tolerated in Israel. So the question I wanted to raise to both of you is, what steps do you each think need to be taken to bridge this divide between the American Jewish leadership and the younger generations?
So what I would hope would happen would be that the most important mainstream American Jewish organizations and leaders would give a very public picture to the idea that you can be a good Zionist and a lover of Israel and have deep, passionate disagreements with some of Israel's policies, and that you can do that publicly. Beyond that, I would hope as part of that there's even a willingness to, in fact, invest money in nurturing that, to recognize that for a lot of younger American Jews outside the Orthodox world, the choice is not going to be between a critical Zionism, a Zionism that has problems with some of Israel's policies publicly, and an uncritical Zionism. It's going to be between a critical Zionism and no Zionism. And that it seems to me, with those people, you should actually invest in trying to show them. And I would do that by bringing Israelis who are publicly critical of their own policies, but doing so from a perspective of love of the state and wanting the state to be the best that it can be in their image, to America's campuses, to model a vision of a passionate Israeli. And those people should be encouraged to talk, not just to bash, to talk about what Israel has achieved, the great admiration they have for Israel's free press, the role that the Israeli Supreme High Court has, but also to say that there are dangers, there are threats, and that to try to enlist young American Jews to some degree in that struggle. And I think, although in particular that might have resonance for more secular American Jews, it was very interesting that there was a piece in Haaretz just a couple of weeks ago, maybe some people saw it, about the young people leading the protests in Sheikh Jarrah to try to prevent people who've been in their homes for 50 years from being pushed out onto the street. And I would just say, by the way, by way of question of permits, vis-a-vis the Palestinian permits, I would encourage anybody to read a little bit about what it's like as a Palestinian to try to get a permit to build a house in East Jerusalem or in the West Bank. And what's fascinating anyway, just vis-a-vis this, is that about 50% of them were actually Dati, who came from religiously observant backgrounds, and spoke very explicitly about the way their own conception of an observant, committed Jewish life, Orthodox Jewish life, in fact, had led them to Sheikh Jarrah. And it seems to me those are the people that I would think, rather than keeping them at arm's length or seeing them as anti-Zionists, in fact, that we would bring them in and try to broaden the tent in that way. And I think that might help to, in fact, make American Zionism, liberal Zionism, more vibrant into the next generation.
A few comments. One is, I mean, Peter had an opportunity for first-hand experience. He would know better than I do. But I think this notion that you can't be critical of Israel in the Jewish community is detached from reality. I mean, here's Peter. He looks okay. There are certain things which are sort of beyond the pale. I don't think Walter Mersheimer are exactly beloved in the Jewish community, but Peter does his thing. Jeffrey Goldberg, criticizes various policies of government in Israel all the time. I could run through a long list of Jews who are still considered pro-Israel, even though in America, and they throw criticisms at Israel all the time, and they haven't been, tarred and feathered and run out of town. And it's a nice sort of, narrative, I suppose, to put out there. But I just don't see that's the case. I mean, Peter's line, it was particularly striking. Was something that AIPAC and Congress of Presidents are policing the boundaries or something like that, as though Howard Core is standing on a watchtower with a spotlight or something. And it's maybe you're not invited to be a plenary speaker at the AIPAC conference, but they're entitled. They're entitled to program their conference however they want. And I can tell you that I do know, going towards where Peter's going, Americans for Peace Now bring in all kinds of people, and they take them to Capitol Hill, and they do briefings on the Hill for staffers, and they have speaking events, and I don't think AIPAC, or anybody else mounting protests outside them, and so on and so forth. So there's plenty of diversity of points of view that are out there, and they're more than tolerated. They're flourishing. In terms of my view, again, to go back to where I started, in terms of the gap, I agree that there is something of a gap. I think what we need to invest in, as I was saying at the outset, is bringing people, American Jews, young and old, closer to Israel. I'm proud of the fact that 75% or whatever it is of Orthodox Jews who respond to the polls say they feel very close to Israel. I'm troubled by the fact that only 16% of Reform or Conservative or secular Jews say they feel very close to Israel. And part of I think the reason why you get such a high number in the Orthodox community is not only because the kids are going to day school and to shul and are hearing and talking and learning about Israel constantly. They're also traveling to Israel more frequently. They're getting up in the morning and they're turning on to the Jerusalem Post website or Haaretz website or whatever. They want to get the Israel news probably before they get whatever other news outlets they do. And we need to instill that kind of sense of concern and that kind of affinity in the community. And again, I think if it leads people to a place where they're concerned but critical, I would take that over apathetic any day. And so I think we have something of a common prescription, and that's a nice note to end on with, again, what was hopefully a machloket l'shem shamayim.
Discussion. Invite everybody downstairs for some light refreshments. To continue the discussion, invite everyone to come back upstairs in about 15 minutes if you'd like to join us for Mincha Mar, continue the discussion maybe a different direction. And join us also tomorrow night as we contemplate some of these same issues in a different vein. Tomorrow night, Eicha will be read at 8:10. Tomorrow night, the past meeting is at 8:25. Thank you again for coming, and thank you again to our speakers.
Political, but is there evidence that when rabbis would choose or a community would select who would be the leaders, that they looked at some of this in the Middle Ages or something?
Yeah, there's some great fights about this kind of stuff. There are hereditary fights where they didn't choose the firstborn son of a rabbi, it was the secondborn son for exactly these kinds of reasons. Yeah, there's some classic fights exactly like this that exist in rabbinic literature. So anyway, I hope with this is a task that we can all work on over this Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur for the rest of our lives, because obviously it's not a short task. And I will invite you back after Simchas Torah on Wednesday night. We will have two classes. Class number one, we're going to look at some important articles. We have just begun the article by Rav Lichtenstein on does halacha recognize an ethic beyond halacha. We will go through that. And the second class, we're going to look at biblical exegesis, at the history of Parshanot HaMikra, starting from the Bible itself and going all the way down to contemporary times, which given the pace that those kind of classes go on will probably take us 5 years to do. We get this huge, big source of stuff. At least, yeah, it was only 7 years.
It took 7 years.
It only took 7 years. Right. But we will, if you want to know how the Tanakh has been read over the ages and why it's been read that way, starting from the Torah itself. Actually, I think the first source we look at is Pete Seeger. But after Pete Seeger, we'll move on to certain things. You'll see why. Because he sang a song called To Everything Turn, 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 which is a biblical text. And so we will look at everything from there all the way down to people like the Chabalevitz and such.
What time is that class?
Right. That's at 8:30.
8. And the first one?
7:30. Okay? So I hope everybody will join us, and I hope everybody will have a great New Year. John displays it through his treatment of the week. And all three of them are like this as you go on. Shanui b'Nevi'im, we see it in the prophets, support the prophets. Ko amar ram v'nisa shochen ad v'kadosh. Thus said the exalted and raised up one who dwells forever and holy. Great God. Uchtiv batrei, and it says after Ve'et daka u'shval ruach, that he deals with the one who's crushed and low of spirit. Mishulash b'ktuvim. It's also in the writings. The Chtivs, it says, Solul rachei baravot b'yashmo. Pray to the God who rides on the clouds. God is his name. Uchtiv batrei, and it says after that, Avi Tamim Dayan Almanot, the father of orphans and the judge of widows. All three are the same, obviously. The same model. Is it modesty? How do you describe modesty to God? But can you ascribe the idea of he knows what he's needed, he knows his place? And after you talk about God in all his glory, which sounds like, shaking up the universe, only dealing with high and noble things, he deals with small things, even more. This is a great polemic against Greek philosophy and Greek thought. Because in Greek philosophy, God doesn't notice little things. The whole world is beneath his notice. So maybe if you're important enough, maybe God knows you. They don't notice orphans and widows. I don't know. The place of God is in the weak, in the downtrodden, in the people who need this. That's a great polemic. But if you just say it's modesty that gets it there, it doesn't get you to the same place. So there are more sources here, but I'm committed to a certain amount of time. You get the idea. The characteristic called anivut, being enough, has the aspect of modesty. You should know your place. You shouldn't ask for too much. But it doesn't only mean that, and it doesn't even start from that. It is a much more profound concept of knowing the place that you occupy, that you rightfully occupy, which means don't take too much, don't stretch beyond, don't try for things that don't belong to you, don't try for things that are not appropriate for you. That's no good. That is the opposite of anivut. That makes you not a good person. And that makes you someone who really doesn't understand who you are, your place in the universe. On the other hand, knowing your place in the universe doesn't mean you're shmata. There are times you stand up for yourself. We saw it with Hillel. But it does mean you're a self-introspective person. You're a person who's constantly working on who am I? What do I fit? What do I want? And therefore, if I don't like what I want, obviously it's not to change it too. It will lead you to a tshuva message. It's a very calming message. I really understand who I am, my worth, my value, my place. I can function differently in that way. I can function with much more confidence. I can understand what contribution I can make. I can know what things I can deal with that come my way because I know I've dealt with them before, because I know who I am and I know, what my skills are, what my talents are. It's really a marvelous thing to try to develop. And it's there from Moshe on as a characteristic to try to work on and try to develop all the time. But as we go into a new year, I think it's a nice thing to think about. I'll take any questions if anybody has any. Yeah.
So it's about knowing that place. But what about perfecting yourselves? So sort of like
that's not anivut. That may be different. That may be a different value. Anivut is not. I mean, there's an implication. If your place is lousy, obviously you should do better. But it is not about that. That may come in issues like Hasidut. That may come in issues like Tzidkut. And that may be a different thing and a different dynamic. But the fact of being an Anav is a different characteristic. Not everything, and this is frankly a good question, because we so often, particularly around Rosh Hashanah, perfect yourself, make yourself better, do this, do that, do that. Very nice. But it's one singular message. The people who write on personality characteristics, all through Jewish history, do not see these things as being one thing. In fact, there's the famous Mesilat Yesharim, the path of the righteous, where Hasidut leads to Nava, Nava leads to this. There's a path that you go. They are different characteristics. And not everything falls into that one thing called trying for perfection. And frankly, if you do that, you won't be able to get anywhere. Because trying for perfection is so amorphous. And what does perfection mean? Nobody's perfect. I mean, one of the interesting things about Jewish thought in general is that the best people we ever had in terms of never sinning, never did anything. The Gemara says that 4 people died, Tuta, Shel, and Nachash, because of the original sin of the snake. Not original sin, but that brought death to the world, so they have to die. So who are they? So you got Binyamin. What did Binyamin, the son of Jacob, what did Binyamin ever do? I mean, he's a pawn in the story. He gets schlepped down to Egypt and all that. But what did he ever do on his own? What did he accomplish? It's, what you call it? What's his name? Kale's father. I'm sorry, Nachshon's father. What did he ever do? Now, you get a whole series of these kind of guys who, what did they ever do? Yishai? I have a couple of stories about Yishai, but he's not David, right? The guys who were the real heroes of Jewish history end up with flaws. So that perfection is not necessarily the thing you strive for. What you strive for is being the best that you can be and making a contribution. But if you play out in the world, you're going to end up in situations where you can't help it. I mean, David, forget David's sin. David's a good example. His whole life he wants to build a temple. He can't do it because he was a man of war. What was he supposed to be? Not a man of war? I mean, it makes him less than perfect. He shed blood. If he hadn't been a man of war, the Philistines would have destroyed the Jews. Pragmatics is a very real element in Jewish thought. Perfectionism is not. I mean, you strive to make yourself better. But you never get there. And at some points it becomes a fool's errand. You can't get there. You have to recognize, there are some things you have to do to deal with your own human reality. It's like Yom Tov. It has to be half for you and half for God. And you're supposed to have a good meal and enjoy yourself and have a nice time. Yeah?
I can definitely see why it's so important, because if you really think much less of yourself, you're not going to try and achieve things. And if you think you're fantastic, in addition to annoying everybody, you're just going to fall on your face. But it's really hard to achieve, right? Because I think when one looks around oneself at work, for example, it's full of both people that are really good, but they are so shy and they don't recognize who they are, as well as people who think they're fantastic and they're much less so. It seems that finding this place is not an easy thing. And where does one get it from? Because society tends to, I think, very easily overvalue some and undervalue others.
It's a self-confidence, really, it's an internal self-confidence. And the fact is, especially in this world where people are so devalued by so many things, everybody has to make themselves bigger than they are. You have to show, I mean, people show off all over the time, in all kinds of ways. And just the idea of religious showing off, all the kinds of showing off just goes on all the time. I think that's a real problem. I didn't say this was easy. None of these that we're going to talk about are going to be particularly easy to do. But they are challenges that are at least attainable to a certain extent. I think there are a lot of things societally and culturally that stack up against the ability to achieve